Welcome back to the Changing the Perception of Sales, the podcast that's designed to change the way people perceive the sales industry. Sales shouldn't be this dirty word. And together with the help of you and our guests, we're looking to add value and share insights to the sales community and together make sales a career of choice. On today's episode, we are joined by Robin Burr, sales therapist and founder of UGen Training. Robin talks about his initial introduction into sales and why his own personal experience of having record months but struggling with consistency encouraged him to look into the psychology and the reasons why, and ultimately led to the transition into the world of coaching and training. He talks about why he believes sales should be treated like therapy, how we can use the power of hypnosis, yes, hypnosis, in sales, and what we can do to all improve on our tonality. Hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Changing the Perception of Sales podcast. Today, I'm very pleased to say we are joined by Robin Burr. Robin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Morning, how you doing?
I'm doing superb on this Friday, last day of May and the month actually. How are you getting on?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for asking. All good.
No problem at all. Well, look, to get things off as we always like to do, just for the listeners and anyone tuning in, please just give a brief introduction really into who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I'm one of those annoying LinkedIn sales trainers that's always telling people that they're doing it wrong. But I recently have embraced the title of sales therapist. So I very much teach and talk a lot about the psychology of selling, bringing emotional intelligence into singing and influence and persuasion. So I like to think I'm got a hint of mystery there that I think we're going to explore a little bit later.
I believe we are. Mystery indeed. And I love the phrase and the terminology sales therapist as well, which we'll definitely tap into. As you mentioned, sales therapist is probably more of a new phrase that you've coined. We always like to go back to the beginning of your journey, really, because unfortunately many people don't always dream of going into sales or don't dream of being a salesperson. So how were you first introduced or entered into the industry, Robin?
I fell into it. You knew I was going to say that.
Shock.
Yeah, but it's true. I think the sales industry, at least when I entered it, which would have seemed like a dinosaur age ago now, but there was a very low barrier to entry. So I came out of school and my highest qualification was a BTEC in performing arts. And nothing wrong with that, but it clearly wasn't the most academically challenging subject. And so I kind of became a bit of a rolling stone, didn't know what I wanted to do. And I saw a job ad one day on one of the job boards for a business development executive. And I thought, oh, that sounds fancy. And they didn't even need any experience. So so I, in my naivety, I travelled all the way to an interview in Milton Keynes, which was about an hour and a half away from where I was living at the time, and that's where I used to commute. And found out that effectively it was just a telemarketer.
We all start that way, and telemarketing in Milton Keynes sounds fabulous. But what was it you were selling at the time in that first role?
Do you know, it was financial services. So we were selling unsecured finance options to small businesses, anywhere from like 0 to 100 staff. But it was just after the 2008 financial crisis. So it was a tough gig to try to sell anything financial or banking related around that time, let alone, and because I had no perception of that, it didn't mean anything to me. All I knew is that I was in a fancy suit and had got a proper job. And I used to tell people this is the bullshit, right? Is when people asked what I did, I used to say I worked in finance because I didn't want to tell people I worked in sales and I was making 80 calls a day. So I used to like dress it up and try and make it sound more fancy than it was. So you just go, yeah, well, I work in finance. And people go, oh, that's impressive. And I'm like, yeah. The things we do, right? For the sky is a sales job.
So true, and it's not the first time I've heard that as well. We've had other people on the podcast that have shared their experience of maybe not being proud about working in sales. What do you think, back in 2008, many years ago now, what was it that was making you say, I work in finance, not, I work in sales?
I think at first, because I was sold the dream. I came into this proper job. I'd been a rolling stone. I'd had like part-time jobs, didn't know what I wanted to do myself, and I was looking for some sort of purpose. I must have been in my late teens, maybe early 20s actually. And so you have to think I'm in the financial district of Milton Keynes, which is, by Milton Keynes standards, quite a nice looking area, and it's quite impressive to be in a building with people who are talking about finance. And I just felt like this was a proper job, and I wanted to hang on to that. The reality was, in the back of my mind, I guess I felt like, is this going to be my job? Just cold calling, completely cold calling. So this is Excel list, just dialing numbers, no strategy, weren't generating our own leads, didn't know who we would be speaking to, trying to flog them finance and credit. And it wasn't as glamorous as maybe I'd been sold. So I tried to, I think, maintain that kind of fanciness of being a business development executive.
That's another one we get. People say I work in business development rather than the word sales. I mean, it's the same thing. Starting then in, again, 2008, many years ago now. How long were you in sales, not necessarily in this one role, but selling in general, before you thought, actually, I'm going to make the transition into training, sales therapy, whatever it may be? What point did you kind of make that decision?
What about 4 years? I think I've been in sales for about 4 years. Yeah, and I just started to crack it. And then I think there's probably a decision I had to make as to whether I keep cracking it and become go on the sales path. But something was calling me to, I think, share the struggles that it had taken me to get to that point, right? Because when you find your first sales gig, and this isn't true for everyone, but at that time it was baptism of fire. You're given a phone, you're given a computer and a list of leads, and you're told to, go at it, tiger, go and make money. There was very little, if any, kind of training and stuff. So when I started exploring training, actually sales techniques, and realizing that it doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't have to be a numbers game, it doesn't have to be competitive, I was so eager to share that with other like mini Robins, so to speak, that were struggling. Because there was at one point, where I was considering whether sales was for me. I thought, is this just something else I suck at? Because I was so up and down. And it was really just because I hadn't learned the right skills or the right mindset, the right processes, all that cool stuff. And as soon as I did, it was just like, I got to share this because people are struggling out there to do this job.
And the reason I ask this question is because I'm sure there's many people that are either in this position right now or have been in this position before where they are struggling, and they're probably questioning whether or not this is the industry or the career for me to stay in. There's managers that probably have people in their team that are going through this right now as well. What was
100%.
the thing or the reasons that actually did make you stick at it and not throw the towel in?
Couldn't do anything else. I mean, it sounds horrible. Like, I'd already tried my hand at doing things like starting a music career, starting an acting career, as you found out recently, and it all gone nowhere. And I just thought, I can't have this as something else that I can't do. I just have to make it work. So it's kind of born out of desperation, and I didn't just want to find just either a job that would just let me roll along being below average. And I guess it's because I thought, and this might be a bit of ego here, I just thought, I'm better than this. I've got to be good at something. I don't want to be below average for the rest of my life. I deserve more. And so that is technically, if you like, my ICP, are people who think, I know I've got potential here. I know that I probably could, if given the right guidance, mentor, training, and skills, do really well at this. And so that's the missing piece that kind of I hope to share with people. So it was just desperation. It was like, I can't be naff at this as well. I've got to get better.
Is that Roundtree's advert you were in? Is that poking around on YouTube anywhere?
It is on YouTube. Yeah.
What
There
year
was
was it? Just on the off chance we were.
year was it? Oh man,
Mm.
would it have been before I got me first? 2006, 2007, maybe.
Yeah, might have to have a look at that afterwards. But obviously, they were the reasons, really honest reasons as to why you stayed in the industry. Those first 4 years, going back to the very beginning, I always like to ask this question more for probably nostalgic purposes. But can you remember your first ever sale and kind of how it made you feel at the time?
Yes, I think I can. I think I can remember my first sale. How did it make me feel? Smug at the time. I remember feeling quite smug. It's got to be, yeah, it's got to be this situation. So we'd all been brought in this organization. We were all new, and there was about six of us. Okay, we all been brought in, all sold the dream, and I think it was about 4 days into the job. We'd had about 2 or 3 days. So I made a sale on my first day, actually. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I was feeling quite smug. First day on the phones. We'd had about 3 days of training, but it wasn't training. It was product knowledge and a bit of motivation and company onboarding and that kind of stuff. And then we'd all got on the phones at the same time. We were all newbies. We didn't know what we were doing. We were all gung-ho, thinking that we were going to, kind of change the world of finance. And so there was a bit of competitive nature going on there. It was like, who can be the first one to get a deal? And it was me. Pure luck, I think. I don't think it was pure luck, but I just remember feeling pretty smug at the time. I can't remember how I did it. But yeah, it made me, gave me a high for the rest of the week at least.
Yeah, you make your own luck. I'm a firm believer in that. But definitely a great thing to do on the first day on the phones. And you mentioned earlier then that part of the motivation 4 years in to make the move into sales training and what it is you do now was actually based on your own story of how the first day in sales went great, but actually that wasn't always the case in the first 4 years. So just give us a bit more of an insight into what the up and down, I guess, sales roller coaster was like for you in those early days.
Yeah, so I think there were times where I was on fire. There were weeks and months where I was on fire and I was smashing it and top of the leaderboard. And comparatively, even though it was a very small environment, we grew pretty quickly. But, I was always kind of seen, if you will, as one of the higher performers. But the reality is that I was pretty inconsistent because I'd equally have these huge highs and then these huge lows. And so overall, it probably balanced out to be, let's say, average, maybe. And that was a theme that actually happened in like a couple of other sales jobs I had. I could come in, I could smash it. There was one occasion where I broke a company sales record that had been there for 2 years, set by the sales director and the co-founder of the company, and I broke it within 3 months. And so that, for me, was part of a feeling of I am amazing because everybody's telling you you're amazing. Everybody's telling you, wow, that's such an achievement. But deep down, you're thinking, I don't know if I can sustain this. Like, it took it out of me. It was pure activity and grit and determination, which has its place, but it wasn't sustainable. And no word of a lie, the next month, big fat zero.
Wow.
It's such a fall from grace because I just completely flushed out my pipeline and just really got at it. And I think I just burned myself out to have one record month. And so you go from this huge high to thinking, I'm amazing. This is my calling. And everybody around you is confirming that. But deep down, there's almost like this imposter syndrome of, I can't keep doing this. Not in this way, at least. And then you just crash. And it was like that for let's say a good couple of years. My first entry into sales.
So interesting. Again, as we record this on the last day of the month, there'll be so many people closing out really hard today, exceeding targets, and then come Monday, back to zero, and got to do it all over again.
Yeah.
And I think that word consistency we hear so often. Often when we're talking about high performance, when people get asked what makes high performance, consistency tends to be the word that is most commonly used. So, from your experience, and that's what you speak to sales teams and salespeople now, like how can, if any salesperson or sales manager is listening to this, what can they do or actions can they take to ensure that they are more consistent in their performance? Because anyone can have a great month, a great day. How can they do
Mm.
it consistently?
Yeah, so I think it's, and this is kind of what started me in my journey of coaching, was to look at how to model excellence. So in every field of life, from sales to business, marketing, sports, the creative arts, all that kind of stuff, there's always people who are way ahead, who are elite performers above the rest by a long way. And so modeling excellence is about eliciting the strategies that they deploy to get their results. And what you find is that 80% of the time, the strategies are actually mental strategies. It's their mindset, it's their outlook, it's their belief systems, it's the way they perceive themselves, it's all of that stuff. Actually, only 20% of it is the actual strategy, like the actual tactical things they do. Because it's the 80%, like a good old Pareto law, that actually dictates how well they do those things. And the interesting thing is that top performers don't always know how they got there. They don't always know why. Or if they do, they're not always able to articulate it. So you take someone who's like, I don't know, you take a Ronaldo or a Tiger Woods and ask them how to take a free kick, how to putt, from huge distances. They can't really tell you, not in a way which is absorbable. You need someone to actually think about what are they thinking and feeling in that moment, and what is going on in their mind, and what are they saying to themselves, and all of those kind of psychological things that make them top performers. And then the 20% of what to do, there's an ebook somewhere on LinkedIn that will tell you how to be successful. But why people don't do it is that I think there's always something mental or psychological holding them back from actually being consistent, which is why people go on these courses. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to sell one soon and I want people to buy it. But a lot of them actually then don't follow through consistently afterwards because they haven't really changed, without sounding like wishy-washy, they haven't changed their psychology.
So a lot to tap into there, and I completely agree. If you ask Ronaldo how he takes it, he's got to the point where he just does it and probably doesn't think about it, which is why it becomes
Mm.
really difficult to replicate and articulate to others. But there will be people listening to this that in their careers have had amazing highs, great months, and then exactly what you mentioned before, a zero the month after. What can they do, whether it's from a mindset or mental perspective? What advice would you give to them to be able to, I guess, stop their mindset holding them back and to achieve more consistent results?
So yeah, somebody asked me maybe not too dissimilar question the other day. They're a junior SDR that I'm coaching, and their question was, "What is one thing I can be doing to be better at selling?" And of course, as you know, there's not one thing. But if you're asking me that question, I'll go to the thing that almost instantly changed my sales game overnight, and it was psychological, and it was the art of detachment. It was the art of being able to detach yourself from the expectation of what might happen. So what you'll find is that, and again, I'll use athletes as an example. You look at top performing athletes; they're not. Michael Jordan's a good example, who famously said, "I'm not competing with the other players; I'm competing with myself." And there's other players who say, "I'm not really trying to win; I'm just trying to enjoy the game." They're focused on the process rather than the results, which seems counterintuitive because we're measured on the results, we're measured on outcomes, we're measured on the number, right? And that's important. But the kind of kicker is you have to detach yourself from the expectation of making a sale or booking a meeting or closing a deal or getting the interview or whatever it is that you're doing, and just focus on what am I doing right here and now in that moment to give myself the best possible chance. And then that in itself frees you up, I think, to tap into all of those unconscious behaviors that you probably have. All that anxiety kind of falls away. So to my example of where I kind of had that record high, I think I was so attached to keeping that number for the next month that I was coming across as desperate. I just know it. And you know what? I think I knew it at the time, but I didn't know how to deal with it. But I just knew that I thought I've had this record high. I'm on a pedestal, which is great. It's very flattering. And I think it just went to my head. And I started to become, I thought I've got to sustain this. So I've got to work harder and I've got to push harder. I've got to close harder. And I think it all came across, tactically speaking, in like my tone, the things I was saying, the way I was coming across to prospects. And it was just, I think it was just off-putting. I was trying too hard. And it's a really hard thing. I've said this before to people who have asked me about detachment. I said, I can't teach you this, actually. It's something I think you need to have an experience of. It's like the sales version of enlightenment, right? It's like you suddenly become at one, and you just realize, okay, I don't need to be attached to this. I just need to enjoy the game, and the right outcomes will come my way. So I think there's a lot to be said for just being able to detach yourself first, and then you can work on all the little strategies and things that you actually do.
I think that desperation is, you can identify it straight away. You can really we talked about tone then, but you can sense it in someone's tonality. I think detachment is something that becomes much easier just with experience in the role. But I think it's much more difficult when you're new to it, for probably all of the increased pressure and all of the other reasons. But I think we're probably naturally making a transition now into talking about what you do now. And you mentioned at the beginning in the introduction that you are a sales therapist. Not sales trainer, not sales coach, sales therapist. So give us, I guess, the thinking behind that phrase and that terminology itself.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I am a sales trainer and coach. I guess I'm just being a bit creative with the label, but I've always had a belief. I say always, not until I started learning more about human psychology and how people make decisions and all of that kind of cool stuff. That sales should be like therapy. When you're talking with a client, they should feel like they are being coached, if you will, and being guided and being helped, rather than being pitched and being sold to. Okay, and by being therapy, I mean you don't sit your client down and say, "Tell me about your childhood. Where did your uncle touch you?" But instead, you take them through frameworks which allow them to um, feel like they can be open, feel like they can share challenges at an emotional level, and you can ask really deep, thought-provoking questions which take them to a place mentally that they've never been before, and they have an entirely new experience. So I think sales should be like therapy. You should be asking those psychologically powerful questions in the right context, of course. And so I think because I've embraced that, because I trained in certain therapies and psychologies, I just married the two up. I'm thinking, well, I wanted to get back into sales. I didn't want to get into clinical therapy. So I thought because there's the money isn't there. So I thought, how can I bring the skills of a therapist or a counselor or a psychologist to the sales world? And kind of came this meshing of sales therapist term.
Like it, so certainly different. And I agree with treating sales like therapy and helping people along the buying journey is definitely way that things are moving. And I can see it's something you're really passionate about. I think there's the brain behind you as well on the shelf. Is it
My brain,
the
yeah,
brain?
yeah. 30 quid this cost me, way too much. Yeah.
That's great. It's quite a high tech brain, in fairness, from
Yeah.
what you've just showed. But it's clearly something that you're passionate about. And what about maybe SDRs that are in the role? They might have been in sales for not too long. You're passionate about the psychology behind buyers and selling. As an SDR, they've probably received loads of product training, probably received plenty of sales training.
Hmm.
Why do you believe they should care about the psychology of maybe why people buy or why people get sold to?
Yeah, because I think when you ask people what sales is, that very broad question, I think early on in your career, it's very easy to fall into the definition of it's an exchange of goods and services for money or whatever. And if you look it up in the dictionary, that's probably not far from what the definition is. However, I think sales is actually more about change. And if there's one thing that you're looking to do, you're looking to change someone's life or their business or their results. But in order to do that, you actually have to change their thinking. And so this is where I liken it to like therapy. If you go and see a therapist, the therapist will ask you questions and try and figure out about where your thinking is holding you back, and hopefully empower you to make new decisions when you leave their office. And that's not too dissimilar, I think, from what we look to do in sales, is we need to first get people to make the decision to change something, and then make the decision to do it with you. And I think the problem that a lot of salespeople make is they either try to get them to change with us straight away, or make both those decisions at once. And that's when you get the kind of vague objections of, oh, I want to think about it, or I need to speak to somebody. You don't get them into decision-based mode because you've given them too much information. And of course you've given them too much information, because that's what you got in your first week on the job. You got all of this product knowledge. You got all of these specs and features and benefits. And so that's now anchored in your comfort zone. That's now your expertise. So of course, when you're dealing with a customer, when you're dealing with a prospect, all of that stuff that's in your comfort zone is going to come out, because it's going to make you feel confident. It's the thing you're most confident talking about. And I think that's the reason why we still have an excessive amount of pitching and feature dumping and benefit puking, is because it's the first thing that you learn when you join an organization. You learn all of the features and benefits of the product. And so that then becomes the first thing that you talk about. The reality is we know from behavioral science, it's the least persuasive way of getting somebody to make a new decision. So it just never, like all the old school sales tactics that actually work against what we know about human behavior, never made sense to me. Like why we keep on doing it.
It still exists now. Benefit puking is a new one. Actually, I've not heard that one before.
I heard
Feature
that from an
dumping.
old sales. Yeah, I heard that from an old sales manager. I wish I could take credit for it. It's still years ago. I heard that. It's still stuck with me. It's got quite a nice ring to it, isn't it?
Yeah, it might make it into my vocabulary now. But I think it's really, really interesting. And you're right, I've still sit on demos and have calls now where, they start with, I'm going to share a 10-minute presentation about us and what we do. And
Yeah.
again, it's just completely counterintuitive. Based on, I guess, your research, what you know from a psychological perspective, I know it's not something we can cover in detail given the time that we've got, but just in simple form, how do people like to buy? You mentioned about the decision, getting them in the decision-making frame of mind, and the old school sales methodologies maybe don't suit that. But how do people like to buy or like to be sold to?
I think everyone's different in terms of what they value and how they make decisions. So they will place different value on things such as novelty, meaning that they'll want they'll want to be making decisions which are more novel, and that's where you get like your early adopters, your 3% of the market that are going to be first to take up an offering, or they'll want things which provide some form of investment, and there's lots of different value markers. But they have to come to the decision themselves. And that's the thing that I think that we don't consider, is that an idea that is your own is way more persuasive and powerful than anything you can tell somebody. And as an example, someone asked me a few months ago, what's your favorite sales movie? So what's your favorite sales movie, Carl?
What's my favorite sales
What's your
movie?
favorite sales movie?
Oh yeah, I'm going to get in trouble for it
Go on.
because it's probably the reason why this podcast exists. My guilty pleasure is The Wolf of Wall Street. It just is.
It's a great movie.
It is.
It's a great movie. Yeah, I love it too. I wouldn't say it's my favorite sales movie, but it's.
What's your favorite?
Mine is, and this is the thing. It's not really a sales movie. It's Inception.
Oh, okay.
Right? You know the Chris Nolan thing. It's like a dream within a dream within a dream and all that stuff.
Very confusing.
It's very confusing. But the reason that's my favorite sales movie is because you think about what the whole plot is they're actually trying to get someone to make a decision. They're trying to get someone to make a decision to disable his father's empire, which is a pretty big decision, right? That's a hard sell. But they make it very, very clear that it has to be his decision. And that's when they have to go into his mind and plant the seed of the idea at such a level of nuance and subtlety that he will act on it of his own accord. That's sales, man.
Love it.
That's what we're doing. So my favorite sales movie is not a sales movie at all.
Right. Inception, if you can get your head around it, definitely recommend you watch, and probably people look at it from a different perspective now. Another one that came into my head, The Pursuit of Happiness, actually. I think that's a great film.
Never seen it. I've never seen it. I've seen the clips of it, but I've never seen the whole thing. It keeps being recommended to me.
Yeah, it's good. Quite emotional, but definitely a film I would recommend for sure. We're kind of, again, now in the therapist psychological frame of mind. There was, as you know, something we are keen to explore and touch upon on this podcast, and it is the world of hypnosis. Now, when I look into the eyes, I'm scared about what's going to happen next, actually, Robin. When we say hypnosis or hypnotherapy, I think people's perception is they have a chain dangled in front of their eyes. They're dancing like a chicken around the room in front of everyone else. And I get the impression that might not be true, though. So what's your experience, or how would you explain to someone that maybe has that perception what hypnosis actually is?
You're true. Lots of people have that perception. It's shrouded in unnecessary mystery, I think, hypnosis, because most of our education comes from either the stage, if we've seen ever a stage show, or comes from the media, like TV or films, and it is dramatized, and it has been given that very archaic kind of look into my eyes and the swinging watch and stuff. But I think one of the things that you learn first when becoming a hypnotherapist is you learn to understand the myths around hypnosis. And actually, it's actually a big part of the clinical process of hypnotherapy. If I ever see a client, they will come with those kind of misconceptions. And it's really important that I let them aware that a lot of their preconceived notions are false. So things like hypnosis is sleep. It's not sleep. It's just a word that we use because the brain understands that's, when it's told to sleep, you close the eyes. Okay, but you're not in a form of sleep. And you're not, for the most part, you're not giving up control. It's not about willpower. It's not like I'm going to make you do something that you're not going to like or you're going to disapprove of. Well, not truly speaking. So there's lots of misconceptions, or that they'll get stuck in hypnosis as well. So hypnosis is just a tool for allowing somebody to enter into a state that we call trance, and that's just where you have enormous amount of focus and attention on your own psychology, and it does make you much more suggestible. It puts you in a heightened state of suggestibility, which is then when you can get people to, forget their name and dance like a chicken and stick their hand to a table and stuff.
Can that actually happen?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. I'd ask if you've ever done that to anyone, but I'm sure there's probably some rules around not being able to disclose that type of stuff. So, really, really interesting. So, again, I've saw it on your profile. I've heard the word and hypnosis in general many, many times. How does it actually work? So or let's say if I was to come in now and have an appointment, how would you get me, or how would I get myself into that state of trance, so to speak?
Do you not remember?
I don't know.
So I think it's important to know that the state of trance is something that we naturally can do, and we naturally do it several times a day. Like, chances are, whatever time people listen to this, you've probably entered trance half a dozen times a day already. And an example will be anything from if you've taken like a long drive somewhere on a familiar route, and you get home and you're like, I don't remember the last quarter mile. I was kind of on autopilot. Like, or certainly on a motorway, you're like, did I miss a junction? I've just been driving, and kind of you lost awareness. You just went away with the fairies for a moment.
Like daydreaming.
Kind of, yeah, yeah. It's and you see it in school, right? When you just seemingly lose focus, you're entering that altered state of consciousness. Now, hypnosis is doing that with intention. So rather than just letting it happen naturally, it's about being a tour guide of that. So it's about reminding people that you're going to go into what might feel like a familiar state. You're still going to hear my voice. You're not going to become like or like zombied out necessarily. That's, you can do covert hypnosis where people can be wide awake, or at least have their eyes open, and they are being hypnotized. So without getting into like the technical detail, it's allowing you to place all of your awareness and your focus on yourself or on anything that I might want you to focus on, to just open up like a passageway. So, I mean, I'm going to get the brain out. The people listening won't be able to see this, but obviously the brain, like, this is just a metaphor, but you saw that this little plastic brain I got splits in half. Well, it's like, if that's your mind, then what I want to do in trance is I just want to like open it up just like a little oyster shell, if you will, and then place suggestions as deep in your psychology as I can, so that when you get back to waking state, you can now carry with you those beliefs or those behaviors or those helpful patterns that you came to see me with. That kind of makes sense? I've probably made that sound more confusing than it needs to be. I'm getting all clinical now.
It helped me understand, because I think the word hypnosis or hypnotherapy probably doesn't do it any favors, because it doesn't really, well, to someone like me, doesn't really explain what it is. But when you say it's to have a heightened focus on one particular thing, and then the suggestions so you can then make change, it does seem a lot more simple to follow. When you think of hypnotherapy and hypnosis, you might think of someone giving up smoking, someone wanting to lose weight, someone maybe overcoming a phobia, which I believe can be done in 9 minutes. Is that true?
Yeah. It can be done. I can do it in 9 minutes. There are people that can do it quicker.
How?
They're better than me.
No, but even 9 minutes is impressive. How is that even possible?
Yeah. I don't actually tell my clients that. I tell them it takes a bit longer, so that they
To charge more.
So yeah. No, but because they become dubious. 9 minutes, really? It's like, yeah, most of it's been done in 9 minutes, and I'll flesh it out with some like relaxation stuff. But yeah, it's, if you think about the brain as a computer, and it's running applications and it's running programs, right? And all of those programs and those applications have lines of code, right? Well, as a hypnotist, I'm kind of like a software engineer. I'm able to go into that program, and either change the code or delete it entirely or replace it with something. And I get to change the programming so that you're now running a behavior which isn't, when you get agitated, have a cigarette. It's to do something else which is more productive.
Interesting. And what has all of this got to do with sales?
So a lot of the time that you are selling, we're using information, and we're using facts, and we're using statistics, and we're using data in the hope that it's going to be persuasive, right? But we know that people make decisions based on their emotions above everything else. Otherwise, everybody in the world would be making logical decisions, and we know that's not the case, right? So we have to accept that decisions are emotional, and it goes back to that sales is about change. So if I have a client that comes to me saying that I have smoked for 40 years and I want to make this life-changing decision that will better me, or if somebody says I have an extreme phobia of flying, but I need to go on this trip, that's change that I'm creating in someone. And of course, they are coming to me for that, and they're coming under a clinical kind of setting. But if sales is about change as well, then there are definitely techniques and there are definitely approaches and principles in hypnosis that we should be bringing over to sales to help people make change ethically. It's not about getting them to do things that we want them to do. It's got to be about helping them to break down their own mental barriers that might be getting in the way of success. When they're open to that, then do a demo. And if they need the logic and they need the stats and data to justify that decision, everyone can do that perfectly well as it is. Like, most demos are fine because it's literally, I'm just clicking buttons and showing you what it does. There's nothing wrong with your sales pitch. There's nothing wrong with your demo. It's that you haven't got that person to open up their mind to it first. You're coming in too early. A bit like, as you said earlier, like, first thing out the gate is, I'm going to show you this.
So, again, I could go down a rabbit hole with all of this stuff. Very, very interesting. I'm sure we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything, but
I'm geeking out, man. I'm sorry, I'm geeking out. You can tell I'm nerdy about
I
this
love it.
stuff.
I love it. It's good. Definitely different to anything we've had on the podcast before. And I'm just thinking, you're obviously qualified hypnotherapist. You know, have all of the knowledge to be able to do this with your patients or people that come to see you. The principles and, I guess, tactics, again, without going into all of the granular detail. If I'm a salesperson that is listening to this going, that actually sounds like it really would work, how could they go about implementing some of these theories into their day-to-day to get their prospects to open their brain, like you just said there?
So one thing we touched on it a little bit earlier as well, without spoiling anything, is around tonality as well. So without having to learn any hypnotic language, and there is a lot of hypnotic language, and that's really what hypnosis is as a practitioner. It's learning how to intentionally use language which open up those neural pathways to suggestion. But before you go and start learning a whole new language, I think tonality plays a big part first and foremost, and being able to use your existing language, what you're comfortable with. And I'm always about word changes and things which are more helpful. But if you didn't have time for that, just learning to control the way that you say things can have some level of impact into how that information is actually received and retained in the brain. Outside of that, you only have to look at some of the more simple principles of persuasion, such as reciprocity, such as commitment, such as authority, which is like the work of Robert Cialdini. There are some of those principles, not all, still stand up and are applicable in a hypnotic sense.
Okay. You mentioned reciprocity there. Excuse my naivety. Well, what does that mean?
So the law of reciprocity was in. So Robert Cialdini did a book called Influence, and talked about. I think at the time it was 6, and I think there's been a 7th one added. But at the time there was 6 principles of persuasion, and one of them was reciprocity. So reciprocation, and this is the idea that if you give somebody something, if you give somebody value in a selfless way, they will feel psychologically obliged to return that favor. It's come under some scrutiny, but the idea is, and there's a study done on this where in a restaurant, if a waitress gave a mint at the end of a dinner, they would get something like on average 4% tips or something like that. If as opposed to not giving a mint, they'd get 4% increase in tips. And then if they gave 2, they would get 15% tips. But then the really interesting bit for me was when they did this. They walk over to the table, they place 1 mint, they walk away. They come back, they turn as they're walking away and go, actually, do you know what? For you, I'll give you a 2nd mint. Okay. And this meant that their tips went up to something like 26%. I don't know the exact state, but they went up like a massive jump because there was this feeling that, this person's done something really nice for me. And it resulted in an increase of tips. So that's the law of reciprocity. It's not flawless, but if you can find a way to input that or one of the other 6 or 7 principles, I think people will start to learn a little bit more about just persuasion in general before they start learning like hypnosis techniques.
Love it. And it's really interesting because that particular study, it's still 2 mints, but it's the way that it's been delivered as opposed to what it actually is. And that kind of brings back to tonality, which we've touched on. But you always hear a lot in sales. It's not necessarily what you say, it's the way that you say it. Or salespeople may
Mm.
get given the advice, you need to work on your tonality, but that covers such a broad spectrum of things.
Yeah.
So when we say tonality, what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah. So if we, do you mind if I geek out?
Please geek out, go for it.
Right. So if we think about the brain in evolutionary terms, and we've been about for 100,000 years, 200,000 years as a species, even longer than that. Language is very new to us. Okay. Before that, before we started to string sentences and linguistics together, we were just making noise. And before that, we had body language. And that's where the theory that body language accounts for more of the way that we communicate, then tonality comes. And then finally, language only accounts for a small portion. Now, language can be enormously effective, but you can say the right things in the wrong way and it not work. So I agree. There's lots of people saying that you should work on your tonality. There's nobody saying exactly how they should do that. One of the things that I think, and Chris Voss talks about this in his book Never Split the Difference, which I'm sure people are familiar with. I think people are familiar with the techniques like mirroring, labels, accusation, audits, but there's another kind of underlying principle that he talks about, and it does come from, I wouldn't say it comes from hypnosis, but it certainly comes from psychology, which is to speak in what he calls a FM radio DJ voice. You remember that? It's just speaking in a very calm, relaxed way. Well, that's not too dissimilar from how, if you think of, and you don't need to know anything about hypnotists or hypnotherapy, but we're all familiar that hypnosis will use a different voice when they're guiding people into trance. Now, it's not always necessary, but the reason is because if you speak at a lower frequency, if you've got rapport with that individual, you will entrain their brain waves to that frequency, which is the one of suggestibility. So your brainwave, when I'm talking to you right now, I can alter your brain waves, literally change your neurochemistry by the pitch alone. And so if I gradually start speaking in a more smooth, and you only need to listen to Morgan Freeman or David Attenborough to go, oh, I think a great narrator voice. It's so soothing and relaxing. It makes me feel relaxed, makes me feel open. And that's the state that we want people to be in when we communicate. Whether a CFO of a enterprise business, you want someone to feel relaxed, open, and calm, right? Get that first before you start getting them to make decisions. So I think that's a good principle. Just low and slow is what I tell people who I coach. Low and slow will take you a long way.
Brilliant. Again, it's kind of the opposite of what we're familiar with in sales, because a lot of the time it's really fast paced, maybe a bit erratic at times, and that kind of low and slow, lower frequency, as you said there, is proven to make people feel more relaxed and then ultimately be probably more in a state to be able to make decisions and make change, which is what sales is all about.
Yeah. And it's because of the anxiety that salespeople have, right? So when we get anxiety, our muscles tighten and your voice box tightens and it makes your voice higher. And we're feeling that anxiety because we've got pointless KPIs and we haven't learned how to detach. So that's why detachment, being relaxed yourself, will actually just relax your voice naturally. But when you're tense, when someone's tense, you can speak to someone, their actual whole body is tightened up, including the vocal cords. And it might only be a slight elevation in pitch, but if that then influences unconsciously your brain waves to think this person's tense, something's wrong, then you're going to clam up as well.
One thing you mentioned there is pointless KPIs, actually. And I was keen to touch on this before we just wrap up with a couple more bits we're keen to touch on. I think I saw a post that you did. It might have been a while ago around, I think it was the volume of calls and maybe changing our thought process on how we approach how many calls we need to make a day. And I think from what I remember, it was um, quite divisive. People on board, people saying, no, we need to make 80 to 100 calls a day. I'm probably somewhat on the fence. I think we need to have a blend of quality in our approach, and not just do activity for the sake of it. But of course, there's a certain level of activity you need to do. When you say
Mm.
pointless KPIs, what do you, or what's your interpretation and meaning of that?
So I think, and I think I know the post you're talking about. I think it's my highest performing post,
It went
and the thing
viral. It went off.
for me, yeah, I think it went massive. And then the interesting thing is that I didn't put any thought into that. I didn't labor over that post like I can do. I can sometimes think about a post really deeply, and like 5 people like it, but this one, I was in a bad mood. And I was running late on a rainy train station platform, and I just wrote this directly into LinkedIn and posted it. Didn't think about it, and it seemed to be popular. But it was around the idea that when I was running a sales team, as I took over, we'd previously had a KPI to do around 80 calls a day. And we then divided our offices, and they needed a regional manager. And I went into that position. And I said to the team, I said, we're going to change our KPIs. We're going to change our call activity KPIs. And everybody groans because they're immediately assuming that you're going to raise them. Right? And instead, I did the opposite. I said, I want it to be 20. And one of the reps said, "Oh, so we've got to do at least 20 calls a day. That's achievable." And I said, "No, I actually want 20 calls to be your maximum. So we're normally doing like, let's try and do at least this. But I'd put forward this notion of I want you to do no more than 20 calls." Of course, nothing was going to happen if they did calls 21 and 22, but I wanted to see how this would change the way they approached. And they started to adopt a mindset of using calls as currency, and they're having to spend them wisely, having to do more with less, which creates a sense of resourcefulness. So now, before they just mindlessly picked up the phone, they were now thinking about, have I researched this person? Have I got a good problem statement and opener to open with? Have I got a value prop or my objection handling ready? Am I in the good state? Have I got the right tone of voice? And the results was, in terms of actual end results like revenue, no change whatsoever. Now, I'd love to have said that it did. We smashed the target more. We didn't, but I found it really interesting that you can get the same results by changing the mindset. And then, of course, if I'd said, right, now let's do 30, 40 calls, well, now you can play the quantity game. But I think people get it wrong. They try to play the quantity game first, and that means you're all maxed out.
Interesting. And the results were the same. How long did you maintain that maximum 20 calls a day for before tweaking the number?
People started to creep up anyway, which was fine. I wasn't going to call it when I'm looking at the call stats. I'm not going like, hey, you
You've
made
done too many
24.
calls.
Don't do too many calls, right? That was never on the cards as such. But they certainly were thinking smart rather than thinking hard, and being a little bit more strategic with it. And in the same token, it's like I wonder how good people's cold calling would be if you made SDRs pay for the cold calls. No one's going to do it, and I'm not suggesting they should. I'm just curious. Would
That
you
is the
just blast?
reality, though.
Would
Yeah.
you just blast out? I know someone's paying for them, right? But would you just blast out 100 calls without any real thought of it, or would you think, "Hey, man, I've got to make this one count"? Provided they pick up, I've got to be more intelligent, or maybe push a little bit harder if that's your thing. But I've got to make this count. I've got to get more information out of it because I haven't got like infinite number of calls. All we do is the reality of it. But I think that's what promotes the old adage of it's a numbers game, which is a belief I haven't always subscribed to.
Yeah. So, yeah, I love the idea behind what you did. And I do agree with it. I think that if you use it as a currency and people maybe just stop and think about the calls they're making, why they're making them, the overall quality, of the calls would probably improve, and actually it would help us probably change the perception of sales, because people on the receiving end would probably have a much better and more positive experience. So yeah, very very interesting thing that you did there. And just a couple of things I want to touch on now, Robin, as we draw to the end. You are doing a little bit of work at the moment, I believe, for the Institute of Sales Professionals, if I'm not mistaken, which is kind of resonates well with what this podcast is all about, is championing sales as a career and making it a career of choice. So just share with us a little bit more around the work that you're doing and the why you're doing it.
Yeah, sure. So the Institute of Professional Sales is um, is a membership organization which is lobbying for the professionalism of the sales industry, of the sales profession. And their goal is to have salespeople in the same category, credibility wise, as engineers and accountants, and that you will, at some point in the future, if they're still working on this, be able to become a chartered salesperson. Okay, which is really learning, and a big focus on them is the ethics of selling, as well as strategic thinking and building customer relationships and all that kind of good stuff, is actually about the ethics and professionalism of selling. And I think that goes back to trying to get more people changing their perception of sales as they move into it. Rather than saying, oh, I fell into sales like I did at the start of this call, they can proudly say, yeah, I am a sales professional, and there are qualifications in ISP, which is where I'm involved. You can do an apprenticeship as a salesperson right now. So any employers that have apprentices, if they didn't know this, is they can use their apprenticeship levy to train up their sales team, which, if you think in terms of training, is likely to generate the most ROI. But it's also, as like a lot of the work that you and your team does, is about changing the perception of sales and not making it something where people will say, oh, I work in finance, because they don't want to say that they work in sales. They can say it with some pride, and that they've been trained to a professional level.
Well, that's the dream, to have people being chartered salespeople. I think it's a good place to be. So we can link the Institute of Sales Professionals when we share this post as well, because it sounds like there's a lot of great work going on there. And final question from me, Robin. You've mentioned Never Split the Difference. You've mentioned different movies. I can see plenty of books on your bookshelf behind you. What book should every salesperson listening to this have to pick up and read, in your opinion?
That's a hard one. I've got an argument for fanatical prospecting, for gap selling, Never Split the Difference, spin selling. I'll tell you the one that started it all for me, and it's a bit of an old one. So it's I can't see, it's somewhere down. It's Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It may be almost 100 years old, but I still think I like the writing style of it. It's quite anecdotal. We didn't quite have the knowledge and the science of psychology at that time to explain why these extraordinarily charismatic people were able to achieve the results they were, how they were able to influence people. We just put it down to like some God-given gift of charisma, which is not true. You can 100% learn all of those skills, but I think at the time the book was published, it didn't know how to articulate that. But now that we have that knowledge, it's a really good read, which is still relevant today. And that was the first kind of sales or personal development type of book I started with. So I reckon I'd recommend that one. Good old Dale Carnegie.
Great recommendation. One that a lot of people say, despite how old it is, still very, very relevant today. Robin, thank you very much for joining us. Very interesting and thought-provoking episode. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Cheers.
Take care.